Hello everyone, and welcome back for another episode on crime-related issues with Olivia and Adele.
It's so good to be back.
The topic we have chosen for this week is poverty and crime. As I'm sure most of you are aware of, one of the reasons why the Regent Park redevelopment initiative was implemented was because it was believed that the poor conditions in which the local residents were living in were associated with violence and crime in the community.
It just so happens that the course we are currently taking, Neighborhoods and Crime, deals with the complex ways in which different actors associate poverty and crime as they relate to specific communities. So who better to help us understand this topic than our professor, Dr. Honor Brabazov, who teaches at the University of Toronto at the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies. First of all, thank you very much for being here. And our first question for you is, within your opinion and expertise, do you believe that there's an association between poverty and crime?
Okay, so I think it really depends what kind of crime you're talking about. So yes, definitely there are certain crimes that are predominantly committed by people with very few means, poor people. And we know this because people with money would not want to, for example, sleep in a public place, or you wouldn't need to steal money to buy food, or steal something to sell to buy food, that kind of thing. So there's definitely a bit of that association. But of course, that doesn't mean that all poor people are criminals, all poor people commit crime, right? And it also doesn't encompass all of the different kinds of crime. So at the same time, there are lots of crimes that poor people definitely do not commit. This includes white-collar crime, for example. It includes corporate tax fraud, things like that. So crimes of need tend to be committed more by poor people. Crimes of greed tend to be committed more by wealthier people. And then, of course, there are a bunch of crimes where there isn't really a difference between poor and rich people in terms of the rate at which they commit those crimes. Sometimes poor people are caught more frequently because poor people might have to commit those crimes in a public place as opposed to in their own homes.
So an example of that would probably be drug offenses.
Yes, definitely.
And to go off of that as well, one of the things that we find in the literature is that while people of higher socioeconomic status have access to the criminal justice system and to legal aid and things like that, poor people may not have those kinds of access. So it goes hand in hand with the idea that if they're outside because they don't have a place to be, or because they just have to be outside, they don't really are frequenting restaurants or things like that, they're going to be more visible to the law, they're going to be more visible to law enforcement agents, and they're also not going to be able to defend themselves or have the same kind of legal representation that someone of higher status would have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the danger with associating associating poor people and poverty with crime is the risk of thinking that all poor people are criminals, or that poor people are responsible somehow for crime, even the crimes of poverty that they commit, as opposed to broader questions around inequality and why we have poor people in the first place.
So where do you think the stigma originates from and comes from, that poor people or all poor people are criminals or involved in criminal deviant behavior?
Well, there's a long history of inequality, obviously, between rich and poor. And when people don't have access to the means of survival, people tend to do things that will enable themselves to survive. And so we can trace some of this stigma back to Victorian England. There's a lot of research that's been done there that looks at how there ended up being, all of a sudden, very poor people and very rich people right up next to each other in cities for the first time. And the wealthy people became very scared that the poor were sort of going to encroach on them and their wealth. And so we kind of see some of that dynamic now as well, that kind of stigma, the fear of the poor.
So research has found that fear of crime tends to be higher in poor racialized neighborhoods. Why do you think this is?
Well, I think it depends whose fear we're talking about. If it's the fear of people from outside those neighborhoods, that those people are afraid in poor and racialized neighborhoods, I think that comes from a number of different things. First of all, rumors of that neighborhood, possibly the stigma attached to it, also racial stereotypes and racism. Sometimes people associate certain signs with poverty and crime, so things like graffiti or broken windows, which are not necessarily actual signs of crime, but because we see those associated with crime in the media, we tend to think that those actually are signs of crime. So if you're coming from outside a neighborhood, you might be fearful for those reasons. You might also look different or seem like an outsider, and so people might be watching you, and so that might make you feel uncomfortable or like you're in some kind of awkward, dangerous situation. But if we're talking about the fear of people who actually live in those neighborhoods, their fear of crime, that's something different. And I think that that kind of fear is elevated because people who are already more vulnerable, it's harder for those people to recover from an instance of crime victimization. So for instance, if your car is stolen and you depend on your car for work, and you really absolutely need it in order to survive, that might be a lot more devastating than if your car is stolen and you own 3 cars, and you have a really good friend who's a lawyer who's going to defend you and make sure that everything is okay. So I think that the reasons for that fear depend on who you are and what kind of financial and social situation you're in.
Yeah, but it also makes sense to kind of label people, neighborhoods. It helps us organize, it helps us group. We label countries as like advanced countries and disadvantaged countries. Like labels are everywhere. What do you think are the disadvantages of these labels, even if they are positive? And what do you think some advantages might be of labeling neighborhoods and poverty?
Well, one of the major disadvantages is obviously the stigma that comes with labeling a neighborhood as disadvantaged or stigmatized, obviously. And I think that that can really affect people materially as well. So in terms of people from those neighborhoods trying to get jobs, if you say that you're from that particular neighborhood, also there might be fewer resources in that neighborhood, particularly if businesses are afraid to set up shop in those neighborhoods, fewer opportunities, and that sort of thing. So those are disadvantages. I think that maybe potentially the only real advantage is that you might get more sort of charities, community programs, funding for that sort of thing. But again, I think that is very limited. I think that it can help a lot in the sort of day-to-day, but it's very limited in terms of actually alleviating poverty and alleviating some of these structural issues in those neighborhoods.
So would you say that another disadvantage should be that by focusing on the bad labels, negative labels of certain neighborhoods, we're also kind of ignoring some of the root causes of the problems, such as inequality? So if we only talk about it in a sense of discourse of this neighborhood, there is bad crime coming from there are poor people coming from there, we don't really get to talk about well, how is education being addressed in the city? Do they have the same kind of access to resources as other neighborhoods would have? What is the funding? So you talked a little bit about the funding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when we associate crime or label certain neighborhoods as high crime neighborhoods, the danger is that we tend to think that the problem arises within that neighborhood and that the solution has to come from that neighborhood, rather than looking at poverty as something that's very much related to wealth, right? Certain people's wealth is based on other people's poverty, and trying to actually narrow that gap between rich and poor.
So speaking about narrowing the gap, Canada does have a welfare system which is accessible to people living in poverty. What is your take on the welfare system in Canada? Do you think we do enough in Canada to help poor and underprivileged people?
I think that we could do better. I think we used to do more. I think that we definitely have the capacity to do more. When you look at the evidence around which policies and which policy choices tend to reduce poverty, tend to increase equality. Those are policy choices that we used to make a lot more and that we tend to make less and less. And we can trace this back to different ideas about crime and different ideas about poverty. So we used to think about poverty as a social responsibility. So if there are poor people in a wealthy nation like Canada, we used to think that that was all of our problem and all of our responsibility. That we would all benefit from a society in which there was less poverty, and so we would all share in those discussions and share in the solutions to that problem. So through more universal social programs, funding for social programs, things that would help everyone. And now we have this sort of turn since maybe around 1980 toward a more neoliberal model where we point fingers a lot more. So we tend to see poverty as the fault of individual poor people. Those people made poor decisions. Those people didn't make the right choices. They deserve to be poor. And they will be punished for being poor. And we tend to take that approach more than the other approach, being that we're all kind of responsible and we should all help to fix the problem of poverty.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. So do you think, in lines with that, do you think gentrification helps or hinders marginalized communities?
Well, I think that there are, again, certain advantages at the surface level. So communities get certain infrastructural advantages, things like pools or more sort of businesses and things like that. But there are, of course, a lot of disadvantages. And I think it depends, or it's useful to look at whether you mean the community is in the geographical space and if it benefits the space or if it benefits actual poor communities. If you're talking about the space, then yeah, you get these resources, these amenities. But if you're talking about actual poor communities, there are a lot of disadvantages, right? So yes, on the one hand, you get more jobs, but they tend to be minimum wage jobs. And the minimum wage isn't very livable, especially in Toronto. You tend to get, other temporary advantages, more grocery stores, things like that, but they tend to be more high-end grocery stores that poor people can't access. And so over time, what tends to happen with gentrification is poor people can no longer really afford to live in those communities and are displaced, are forced to move to other areas. So for poor communities, not really very good. For wealthier people moving in, it can be very advantageous because you're getting cheaper real estate and all these amenities. The neighborhoods can be quite hip in the moments when they're being gentrified. But yeah, so I would say on the whole, definite disadvantages for poor communities.
Yeah, so we just want to thank you for coming in today and taking your time to speak to us. Everyone here at Regent Park TV really appreciates having you in today.
Oh, thanks. It was my pleasure.
Yeah.
There you have it, folks. Thank you for watching. See you next time.